I'm sure you have many questions, so write them down and we'll collect them in a moment. I just wanted to reiterate a number of points regarding the whole book, so we'll have a general picture and then we can dwell on the specific discussion. So I think after looking through the book, it is really a thorough piece that looks into the whole problematics of conquering an area and dealing with the problems in this conquered area, whether it is collaboration, nationality problem, political affiliation, war crimes. All these questions come up to the Soviet regime the moment the regime comes up and conquers it and then has to decide what to do with it. And I think Alexander really in his book, we can see the way he deals with a number of questions, but some of the approaches are really interesting and should be pointed out. First, he stresses how trials, the issue of occupation and retaliation that occur there in the course of the war are in fact part of internal politics of the Soviet Union. So this connection between what is going on in the front and what is going on internally, which is very important, and I think it came up also in our discussion, and it connects also not only on a level of internal external, but also on the timely access, in that sense that we saw that trials, for example, Nuremberg, decided to focus on a specific time period, while Alexander Melnik draws our attention to the Soviet experiences and experiences of different nationalities and groups before the war and then consequently through the war. This is the second thing. The third thing is the emphasis on the historical narrative that comes up from the trials and how the war shapes narratives, how the state tries to use the war in order to shape a certain narrative that would then mobilize certain groups for the war, but also would mobilize them as part of the Soviet regime, and I think this is very important as well. So I thought in this context I have a number of questions and then we'll collect. So one question in this context of mobilization comes to mind. One of the phenomenon that historians underline is that the war actually helped mobilize regular Soviet citizens, led them to identify with the Soviet state in the course of the war. So Nazi crimes kind of made really like, we have this model of turning peasants into Frenchmen, so turning citizens under Soviet forced regime into Soviet citizens. But I think one of the issue of nationality and the issue of collaboration in the Holocaust undermine this model. So I wondered whether you could elaborate on that. To what extent the war helped create a unified Soviet Union or actually caused the breaking it apart.
Do you want to take more questions or just answer one by one?
I think let's, if you could answer, and then I have another one or two, and then we'll open it, yeah.
Well, I think this is absolutely valid point that you're making. It is true that the Soviet government is purposefully leveraging Nazi crimes from the very first days of the invasion as a way to mobilize the population for the war effort. And I think it certainly worked, but as you know, that there was a complicating factor in the occupied territory, because the occupation regime is very corrosive because of the significant power discrepancies. It is often easy for the occupiers, especially if they are winning, to mobilize certain segments of the local population in various ways. And sometimes it doesn't have to be hardcore collaboration. It could be less significant acts of compromises. And the Soviets become aware of this and already during the occupation, but especially after the returning to the formerly occupied territories. So they constantly have to negotiate different imperatives of having to mobilize the population for the war effort, including by drafting men into the armed forces. They have to rebuild the economy of the country. They also have to secure the rear areas, so the repression, because there are so many people that could potentially fall under repression, the repression cannot be too severe, so they have to treat certain groups leniently. And obfuscating collaboration in the public discourses becomes also one vehicle for lessening the problems with legitimacy in this context. That's why they choose to foreground the Nazi responsibility for the occupation and war crimes and sort of marginalized collaboration in the public discourse, because especially in the ethnic peripheries of the empire, because it becomes easier for them to integrate the population politically in this manner. But the other aspect of this story is that they draft huge numbers of people into the Red Army in the formerly occupied territories, including some people who were formerly in the Red Army, but then at the start of the war deserted or simply settled in the occupied territories after the defeats, or were released from POW camps by Germans. And some even served in like police structures or otherwise cooperated with the Germans. So there is a very complicated dynamic. So there is discursive integration, but there is also experiential integration into the Soviet project by participation. And these people subsequently have an opportunity to rewrite their personal stories after the war. And I actually had, unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but about 15 years ago I had a chance to talk to a man in my town. And he was a war veteran, Soviet war veteran, was quite young during the war, maybe 19 years of age. But he told me in this face-to-face interview that he served in the police, and even his relatives didn't know about that. I don't think he committed anything serious, and I said many collaborators were not persecuted by the Soviet states for various reasons, and they could re-enter the Soviet political community through the experience of military service in this case. And it's also noteworthy that even after they draft a lot of these men, the Soviets continue to search for war criminals even during the post-war years. And in some cases, we have data now, we have electronic databases, for example, of heroes of the Soviet Union and various highly decorated individuals. And the data indicate that at least 13 heroes of the Soviet Union were stripped of their awards for what they did during the occupation. So this is quite significant. That indicates both the technology of political integration, but how the Soviet state chooses to go about various conflicting issues in the context of the post-occupation reordering of the society and the political order.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the way the Soviets treat collaborators, I was wondering how law fits into that. You mentioned absorbing collaboration, the willingness of the state to absorb collaboration, and I was thinking about it in the context of the public trial versus the secret or not official trials. This question came up also in other sessions, and I was wondering how this played out in the Soviet context. When was law chosen to be an official, clear law, and when was it not used or actually used in a quieter way?
Well, it's a good question, because the low-level trials, we have there's multiple tiers of the public trials in this. That's obviously the Nuremberg trial of major Nazi war criminals. Then in the context of the Soviet Union, you have multiple high-profile trials between 1943 and 1947. So Krasnodar was the first, and there was the trial in Krasnodon, Kharkov. In 1945-46, there were trials in Leningrad, Kyiv, Mykolaiv, Minsk, and other places. And then one tier below that, there are local trials. They target less significant people, and it's not clear for me personally. I have a chapter on one such trial the investigation that I'm undergirded in the book, it's not clear for me what is the logic in specific cases. It's obviously they are trying to send some political message to the population. The case that I examined, there was the pogrom in Kyiv in 1941, and they put on trial 3 most active perpetrators, even though they had evidence of several dozens of people being complicit in one way or the other. And my reading of the situation is that through this trial, they projected a certain political narrative that they wanted the population to identify with. And that narrative was that the collaboration and local complicity in the war crimes during the occupation was relatively marginal. So they, by putting these 3 most serious perpetrators on trial publicly, they kind of exculpated the rest. And that fits into this broader narrative of emphasis on Nazi crimes and a marginalization of collaboration in the public discourse. Then, of course, there is the issue of nationalist insurgencies in the western border regions. And this is also a very interesting question. As I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, while the trials were in progress in Nuremberg and also Kyiv, Mykolaiv trials in Ukraine, the security agencies in Ukraine collected evidence of crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists. And there was articulated anticipation that the leaders of nationalist organizations would be put on public trial. But it didn't happen. And the way I read it, the reason it didn't happen, because it was too unpredictable politically, because symbolic politics of show trials is complex. Because they were dealing with various nationality issues, sort of putting on trial this particular group of individuals could have undesired effect on identity needs of Ukrainians as an ethnic groups. And because the Soviets tried to position Soviet Ukrainian identity as a sort of constituent element of the Soviet identity discourse, they feared to antagonize Ukrainian populations, particularly in the context where they faced the important political challenge from Ukrainian nationalists, not only in Western Ukraine where the insurgency was in progress, but also in much of Ukraine where the nationalist underground came into existence during the occupation. So this is, I think, why they tread very carefully with this public discourse at the all-Union and Republican level. In fact, some prominent literary works at the time when they spoke about the nationalist insurgency, they didn't even reference the ethnic identity of the insurgents. They wouldn't describe them as Ukrainian nationalists, but would simply call them bandits without any ethnic indications. And then there is also perception among Red Army soldiers, particularly if they were ethnic Russians, which was noted by many representatives of the Soviet Ukrainian, but not only Soviet Ukrainian, also Russian intellectuals who were covering the war as journalists, for example, that the Russian soldiers who were coming into Ukraine were very hostile to the local population because they charged them with compromising with the Germans, right? So they have to tread very carefully not to increase ethnic tensions among the population that was now under their sovereignty, right? So that's why they kind of marginalize collaboration, but they also don't want to denounce Ukrainian nationalists too much at the level that they denounce Nazi war criminals, for example. So they stage trials of local nationalists, of Ukrainian nationalists locally, where they do also public executions in cities, they publicize it in local press, but they don't publicize it, for example, in central press.
Okay. So it is significant whom they do not put on trial, and not only who they do put on trial. Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting, maybe connected to the question of agency that you bring up in your book, because you're trying to give agency to other levels, not only look from the state top down, but look from the bottom up. The question of to what extent people who participated in those trials became agents of their own story. So the state wanted to promote a certain narrative during the trial, but then the question is whether the people at the trial managed to promote their own narrative. Because I think this is a very important question in the Soviet Union, because in the 30s, we know that they did not really manage to go to kind of send a message through court, something that in the 60s was possible with the dissidents. So I would like to ask you about to what extent people who went through the trials managed to send a certain message to the others, or the moment you were part of the trial, that's it. You were inside the Soviet narrative. But before I do that, I really have to read like the opening of your book, because it really connects to what we discussed regarding the witnesses and victims. So Alexander Melik opens with an excerpt of the letter to Petro Veshirov. And the excerpt goes like this. It's letter to Petro Veshirov by Alexander Dovzhenko in June 1943. Write as much as possible. Do not trust memory. Record your thoughts, the thoughts of Kovpak and other people. Let partisans write. Teach them, encourage them, let them keep diaries, intimate and warm, not officious reports for household use, etc. So, agency, if you want to comment, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you. Regarding the sort of discourse of the trials, I think because repression is categorical, it is very difficult for people who find themselves in closed sittings of military tribunals, or even during the investigation, to consistently project their narrative of the events, because the security officers take a very part in constructing the narrative of Soviet power even during the interrogations. I have the chapter on Ukrainian nationalists on the ground in the Kyiv region during the occupation, and then on the investigation itself. And it is very obvious in that case how they structure the interrogations themselves, where during the very process of interrogations, the officers attempt to get the suspects essentially to give up their narrative of history. So in one case, they're interrogating the Orthodox priest about the commemorations, about the nationalist commemorations that took place in several villages of the region during the occupation. And one commemoration concerned sort of the commemoration of the Soviet massacre of anti-Soviet insurgents during the Civil War in 1920. And the other was about the famine of 1932, 1933. So in both cases, they went to considerable lengths to force the defendants to articulate the Soviet narrative of those events by evaluating the events in a manner desirable for the communist regime. So in my way, even at this level, the Soviet state structures the discourse even at the micro level, not to mention the macro narrative. So the agency of people who find themselves in the teeth of the Soviet system of political justice is very limited. However, they certainly try to influence the directions of investigations. And when we look, for example, at another domain, sort of the resistance, participants of the resistance movement, or alleged participants of the resistance movement, they oftentimes enter into very complicated negotiation with authorities and trying to project their narrative of what happened during the occupation to secure their place in the community of resistance. And that entails sometimes strategies, different strategies of engagement with different segments of the Soviet state bureaucracy, but also attempts to forge alliances with different segments of the local population who could corroborate their narratives about what happened during the occupation. And sometimes they are successful, often they are not successful, depending which institutions of the Soviet state was in charge of the investigation. And sometimes personal relationships mattered a lot too, because we have evidence that, for example, certain officials of the Ukrainian headquarters of the partisan movement who conducted verification of various partisan units and underground groups, when they had been personally acquainted with certain alleged participants of the resistance movement, were a lot more, how to put it, inclined to recognize such entities as legitimate participants in the resistance movement.
Thank you. Thank you. The floor is open for questions. Let's see, we'll check whether Alexander can hear you from your place, or you need to come here and ask the question. Lior, do you want to come here?
Can you hear me? Alexander, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you for this presentation and congratulations for the book. I wanted to raise a question that is directly connected to our last session, actually last two sessions, which is bottom-up and top-down. So it seems to me from what you described is that for the state, for the Soviet state, the interest in collaboration really changed. During the war, there is a need to repress collaboration in order to win the war, but after you reconquer the region, you don't want to actually deal with collaborators because it is too risky and you need solidarity. But this is the point of view of the state. If you look at the bottom up at the Jewish community and the Jewish organization, it's quite different because for them after the war, it's very important to bring the collaborators to trial, and not only this, these collaborators continue after the war in the sense that they go back to their Ukrainian places and they are not being allowed to get back their property and so forth. So the Jewish representatives of the Jewish committee, anti-fascist committee, for example, they want to put in the center the collaboration. So I wonder whether you can discuss it, how these different lens allow us to look differently at the story and what happened to our history when we only look at it through the lens of the state and what the state is.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I actually discussed some of these issues in the book itself. I couldn't bring everything into a short presentation. You're absolutely correct. Yes, there is the grassroots demands for justice, and they stem obviously from Jewish survivors who lost a lot of relatives. There is also vigilante violence in many cases, but it doesn't come exclusively from Jewish citizens of the Soviet Union. There's, for example, a very important element of vigilante violence takes place in the areas of former partisan operations, because the conflict there was often so severe, and one could describe it even in categories of the civil war, because in some areas there were very few Germans, so the fighting was between police forces and partisans. So it was very bloody conflict. And so after the Soviet power is re-established, sometimes partisans go out, seek collaborators and kill them, and sometimes the state prosecutes partisans for sort of violating its monopoly of violence, right, in the aftermath of the occupation. But I think maybe I didn't make myself clear enough in the presentations. The Soviet state continued to repress collaborators even after the reestablishing rule over the formerly occupied territories, but the repression became more severe for individuals who were involved in, for example, mass killings. They sometimes were put on public trials and even publicly hanged. But the collaboration was much more expensive than participation in mass killings. Sometimes people worked as agricultural specialists or were mobilized into the police or military units and didn't commit serious crimes other than the fact that they carried weapons and guarded some objects or participated in certain operations of the Nazi states, that in the view of the Soviet officialdom didn't warrant severe punishment. So they would be punished less severely, or sometimes didn't punish at all, but were simply drafted into the army or penal formations of the army and after the war they could return to their occupation. And of course that would create tensions in the communities after the war, and some people would be, for example, working as agricultural specialists in the villages and sometimes holding superior positions over certain locals whose relatives, for example, served in the Red Army, and they would write letters to their relatives in the military units, which Soviet security agencies would then intercept and note these constant complaints about collaborators in the Soviet institutions. So there are different elements of grassroots pressure on the Soviet state to do something about collaborators, and they proceed after the war gradually. They remove people from these positions of power. They publicly punish the more compromised individuals, but they also attempt to integrate the less compromised ones. And I think your point is correct about the Jewish survivors, and the grassroots demands for justice were continuous throughout the post-war era.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And please, so what was the main impact, main influence of the World War on Ukrainian identity?
Well, I think the argument that I make in the book is that the war was essentially what created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in its present borders as they emerged in 1991. Obviously the incorporation of the western border regions in 1939, 1940, and Transcarpathia in 1945, and when the Crimea was added in 1954, that was basically the final piece of the territory. So the paradox is that it was the Stalinist regime essentially that realized the dreams of several generations of Ukrainian nationalists and actually forged the unified state. Created its institutions, secured its international recognition. Ukraine was one of the founding members of the United Nations in 1945. So that's the argument that I make in the book.
Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask is, because you didn't really touch upon it, but maybe you do during the book, is perhaps to what extent did the Soviets use perhaps the international humanitarian law or law of occupation as a legitimizing tool for their occupation, or perhaps as a tool against the Nazi criminality, if at all?
So sorry, I think I didn't understand your question. Could you rephrase it a bit?
Yes. So essentially, did the Soviets use the law of occupation as a tool to legitimize their actions during their occupation, or perhaps did they use it as a way to delegitimize the Nazi criminality and use it as a tool to broaden their the political legitimacy of the prosecution?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as I understand, the Soviets used the issue of Nazi crimes as a tool of political mobilization in the Soviet Union itself since the start of the war. And they started to cover these issues basically from the first day of the war, and they emphasized the maltreatment of vulnerable sort of population groups, which the majority population would find the easiest to emphasize with. That would be like women, children, prisoners of war. Importantly, they became aware of the Holocaust quite early through Soviet intelligence reports. They streamed basically to the Soviet leadership already in the course of July and August. They had awareness of the consistent pattern of victimization and mass killings in the occupied territory. But in the public discourse, they covered these issues, but they didn't do so consistently. And the reason they didn't do so consistently because they didn't want to play into the hand of the Nazi propaganda, which represented the Soviet state as a Jewish state, essentially. The Judeo-Bolsheviks is the central sort of frame of the Nazi propaganda discourse during the occupation. And so they present the mass killings of Jews in the occupied territories within this broader framework of the victimization of the generic Soviet population. So this is one element, is the internal mobilization, but also in time, as the war continued, they also framed the war more broadly. They start talking, for example, about Nazi occupation policies in Europe. For example, in the Balkans, they project all the pan-Slavic themes, which were prominent already during the imperial era. And they also position the Soviet Union as the defender of the civilization against barbarians. The Nazis are presented as modern-day barbarians, so they are the defenders of civilization. And you can see, so this is, of course, has elements of increasing the prestige and soft power of the Soviet state abroad. And when they publicized Nazi crimes inside the Soviet Union, they used a wide variety of institutions. Obviously, the Soviet Informational Bureau is one vehicle. Then you have the press and radio. Then museums organized various exhibitions. In 1942, in late 1942, they created the so-called Extraordinary State Commissions for the documentation and investigation of atrocities of German fascists and damage to the public and communal property, which propounds various reports into the public arena, while essentially being a front for the Soviet security agencies which provide the bulk of the information. Then the show trials of war criminals serve the same objectives. Abroad, they have a variety of institutions that organize exhibitions in various foreign countries. For example, WOX, I can't remember now how to decipher this abbreviation in English, but basically it's a cultural institutions that fostered cultural exchange in various countries. So yes, there is both internal political dimension and foreign policy dimension of the discourse on Nazi crimes during the war.
Yes, please.
Yes, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes?
Yes. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I would like to know on which, if you study more specifically a specific region in Ukraine, or if you had a broad overview of the whole republic, and also which kind of sources you use. And I ask this question in order to know how you consider the conclusions of Amir Weiner, who worked on Vinitsa, or Masha Serovich, who worked on the partisan movement in Ukraine and Belarus, and who, as far as I remember, concluded that the killing of collaborators in the partisan units became quite spontaneously and was later legalized by Moscow, but it was really a grassroots thing for what it's worth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I use materials from different archives, from Moscow, from Kiev, and several regional archives in Ukraine, specifically Kiev and Kherson. But the materials from Kiev, for example, which are central, like I worked in multiple archives and they cover the entire scope of the Republic, and I obviously covered, I think, the majority of scholarly works that cover different aspects of the occupation. So some of my chapters are general, covering the whole Soviet, the scope of the whole Soviet Union. Some cover the Republican level, and some go down to the level of individual regions. So I think I have a pretty representative picture of what is happening in different areas. But I'm also conscious that if we go to the grassroots level by means of undertaking case studies of individual institutions or individual regions, or say individual partisan units even, the picture could be considerably more complicated. And I agree there is a necessity for different approach, both at micro and macro level, and consistent dialogue between various narratives and integration. Regarding your second questions about the books by Amir Weiner and Masha Serovich, I think both are important works. I haven't read Serovich's books, I have read some of the articles. Certain issues I would disagree with. I think Serovich overemphasizes the initiative of partisan warlords and initiating killings of collaborators. And she mostly examines, as I understand, the developments in Belarus. My sense is, and I have worked with materials of Soviet special services, is the orders come from the center. And they, starting with Stalin's speech on 3rd of July, the policy line was from the very start to kill collaborators as a way to prevent collaboration and in this manner to weaken the Nazi occupation regime. Of course, most partisan units disintegrated in 1941 as a result of German counterinsurgency, Red Army defeats, many partisans simply exiting to the Soviet-controlled territories or ceasing resistance. But nonetheless, they couldn't be, those who remained in the forest, and approximately 10% of partisan units remained active in 1942 compared to what was there in 1941, and that they were strengthened by Red Army soldiers who were caught, stranded in the occupied territory. They, of course, were aware of the official discourse towards collaboration. Sometimes they killed collaborators as a matter of their own security. For example, when they suspected certain individuals of informing the Germans about the locations of partisans. So there is both the local dimension, which could be quite emotive, but there is also the broader context of Soviet policies, which they were aware of and which they couldn't ignore, especially as the time went on and Soviet special services started to send in organizational groups to the occupied territory. For example, I have an article that is coming out, I guess in spring. It deals with the operational groups of the KGB, which is Soviet Special Service, in Ukraine specifically, and I cover the experience of 6 operational groups which in late 1943, early 1944 were dispatched to the occupied parts of Ukraine and were attached to various partisan formations that conducted raids from Belarus and central Ukraine to western Ukraine and even Poland. And in this process, and they had various assignments, but one of the assignments was gathering intelligence, recruiting agencies, and they also assassinated a lot of collaborators. Like each group killed dozens of policemen, of Ukrainian nationalists. So this is something that doesn't come only from the grassroots level. As far as Amir Weiner's book is concerned, I think it's very important work. It obviously uses the case of the Vinnytsia region, but also makes a number of conclusions that apply to the broader domain of Soviet politics of memory, I guess, in the aftermath, ideology in the aftermath of the war. I think he makes a number of valid points. I also disagree with a number of things, as I made clear in various chapters of my book. For example, I think he overemphasizes the extent of distrust that the Soviet leadership felt towards partisans, and that stems in part from his over-reliance on the materials in the Vinnytsia region. I think when you look at the level of the Republic, it is obvious that a lot of partisan commanders became part of the Soviet elite already during the war years. They featured in various public performances. Some, like Sidor Kolpak, already wrote memoir in 1946. I think Petrovich Shagara, who I cited, who's the letter Dovzhenko wrote that I cited in the epigraph of my study, also wrote a memoir, was the hero of the Soviet Union. They were very prominent public figures. So that's not so simple. The same issue with collaborators. I think Weiner makes an argument in some book that the Soviet treatment of collaborators was uncompromising. I would agree with this only partly. It was uncompromising towards collaborators who committed serious war crimes like murder or torture. The Soviet state consistently persecuted such individuals, but as I said, in other cases the treatment was quite differential, and some people were not put on trial at all.
Yeah. Any more questions? Well, I have to say that the only question we're left with is, after reading the book or discussing it, how this is going to interplay, how we bring it to the situation today.
Yeah. Because it's exactly the opposite story of the treatment of Soviets then is completely opposite of the narrative that they are promoting, the Russian promote today, putting in the center the Ukrainian collaborationists and putting at the center the Holocaust, both things that were downplayed after the war. So it's interesting whether it's anyway embarrassing for them if you bring back the old narrative, or they just say this is a Soviet narrative and we are Russian and it's a different narrative, because the narratives just are completely the reversal.
Yeah, I thank you for leading me to a question in the chat. Can you see it, Alexander? No. Okay.
You should read it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a question regarding the moratorium on death penalties. The VMN between 1947 and 1950 meant that many convicts who might otherwise been executed in the 1940s instead served time in the different camps and were released under the mid-1950s amnesties. But in the 1940s, the investigative files of persons arrested under Article 58 rarely show the suspect denying their participation in collaboration or treason and blood crimes. Have you seen any evidence that the defendants between 1947 and 1950 knew about the status of this special moratorium at the time they were under investigation, and thus felt free to admit crimes in the belief that they would not face any maximum penalty? And the question is from, I cannot decipher the name exactly, but
yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm aware of that law, but I haven't worked with the large number enough of files to be able to answer it competently, I think, at this point.
Okay, a good question for further research. Whoever
for further research, yes.
Yeah, whoever is interested, it's a good question regarding the amnesties and what were the policies and what happened to the people who were caught at the time of amnesties, because we know that there was this revolving door of people going out and going in. Wow, thank you so much. It was fascinating, and
thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Thanks again, and have a good day there.